this positive feedback or negative feedback really is not a little more confusing. So this is a case where both people try to do the same thing as each other. So the words are different, but the color is the same, so it's still good, it's green. So each person is trying to do the same as the other. So again, these are plots of attitude as a function of time. Here both people start off the same, and they both wind up being happy. And here they start off a little bit different, and they also wind up being happy. And here they start off different. One of them starts off so negative that it drags both of them down. So this is, in Martin Deutsch's sense, they sink or swim together. Both people wind up doing the same thing. And so what's interesting is, first of all, everything is different above a threshold. Once the interaction exceeds this threshold, how both groups behave is different. And what's interesting about this threshold has nothing to do with the thresholds of those influence functions. It technically actually has to do with the slope near zero of those influence functions. And when the interaction is actually bigger than that slope, then you get this different behavior. So as the interaction increases, there's a sharp rather than a gentle transition to new behavior. And in fact, the threshold is set quantitatively equal to the inertia to change. So the more resistant, or the more people remember what they were doing, the higher the influence has to be from the other group in order for this threshold to take effect, which again all sort of makes sense. And in this case, both groups wind up being happy or unhappy. And where they wind up depends sensitively on where they start and what their states are when they're alone from each other. And those two variables determine whether they both wind up being happy or unhappy. And this means that these seemingly small differences in cultural, racial, or ethnic differences over the long term can produce large effects, whether both groups wind up being happy or both groups wind up being unhappy. Yeah, you want to say something?
Sorry, I was...
I'm sorry, I can...
That's okay. Thank you.
Can we have a copy of the presentation?
Sure,
again?
yeah. Okay, let me pull it back up. So, this is actually the first time I've left out a slide, because I'm apparently a pretty complete nerd about these sort of things. So it's sort of interesting to have finally done it. And my life hasn't ended either, so it's fine. This was the description of where we were before. And what's interesting, again, in this model is these different types of behavior depend on the parameters. So as I said, when people's inertia to change is larger, the value of the threshold is higher at which things change. And actually, what Gottman's group found in terms of marriage, the single most important parameter is how each person feels alone. And whether the marriage stays together or not really depends whether each person is happy when they're by themselves. Now, if you're in a really bad marriage, you know, if someone puts you in a room for 20 minutes, it's not going to make you happy when you're away from your partner. So, you know, whether that measurement of individual happiness is really true or is really part of the relationship is not so clear. But that was the single variable that had the strongest statistical influence on whether people stayed together, is whether they were happy by themselves.
But you know, experimentally, it has a lot of good inferences for us, because it tells us that these risk of loss of agency, you know, when you are in a conflict and you actually believe that the only thing that you can do is to go to war, because that's the only thing that happened. The only thing that you can do is to give yourself to the conflict is actually not necessarily true, and it has actually the capacity to retain in your own individual space, you know, this moment of generative, creative, different response is actually a powerful response to the system as such.
Right, we're going to see the one thing that turns out most interesting to do in this model is when we have a system and we suddenly change what the people are doing, and we see how that changes things.
Very good.
We're going to see that. So to get back to the opposite case, so in this case, if, again, these are plots of attitude versus time. And let me emphasize again, because I give this to social psych people, so this is all made up. There's no data, there's no information here. This is just from the model, that we put in what seem to be reasonable assumptions, and we're not looking at any data at all. We're just looking at the output of the model, and then we're going to try to use the model to come to some interesting conclusions, and then see if those are real. So if we start off people with exactly the same initial conditions, and exactly the same parameters, and we let them go, even though they do the opposite thing, they wind up being neutral. But if we start them with ever so slightly different initial conditions, or ever so slightly different feelings of how they feel when they're alone, look what they do. They both start off together, and they stay neutral for a while, but then they separate. And in Martin Deutsch's term, one swims and the other sinks. So one of them winds up happy and the other is unhappy. But they're first drawn together and then they separate. It's very important to understand there is no event that happens here. If you just saw this in data, you would say that these people are doing okay, and suddenly they decided to hate each other, that there was some precipitating event. There is no precipitating event that happens here. The structure of these very simple assumptions, that there's an inertia change, that you have feelings by yourself, and that you react to the other person, those very simple assumptions in words, when translated into equations, predict that people will first be drawn together and then separate. So this is the reason why we need to use the mathematics. We would have never guessed that those very simple assumptions in words would lead to this kind of behavior. And technically this is called a saddle point. People are drawn to it in one direction and separate from another direction. So what we see here is that small differences at the beginning can produce these large effects over time, and when the groups are ever so slightly different, then one group will wind up happy and the other unhappy. And as I said, very often we would attribute something like this we saw in the data to an external trigger, but here it's entirely generated internally from those very simple assumptions. And you know, this
but the assumptions is powerful enough. That is to say, to do the opposite of what the others are doing.
Right, right.
So I mean, it's an interesting assumption.
Right. Okay. So this is also a case. Now, in this case, where one person tries to do the same, and the other one tries to do the opposite, is a case I couldn't figure out in words at all. Although after you see the mathematics seems to make sense. And here, what we see in the mathematics is that both groups oscillate in time and then reach a neutral level. The fact that they would reach a neutral level, I don't think I could predict in words, but the oscillation in time makes sense, because one of them keeps trying to do the same thing, and the other one is doing the opposite, so you can see why that would create oscillations in the system. And again, if that, from the model, we could compute the period, the frequency of these oscillations. We know what parameters they depend on in the model. And again, the model is telling us something that we wouldn't have guessed otherwise, that there have to be oscillations and they have to reach a neutral state. So again, both groups oscillate, they reach a neutral state. Now this is interesting already, because in the conflict resolution literature, a lot of the idea is that if you have a conflict, a bad conflict between two people, let's say two people, that if you're trying to get them to act better, you get one to act better, and you hope that person will get the other person to act better. What this is saying is, so that's Martin Deutsch's crude law, actually. And what this is saying is something much stronger than that. It says you can change the nature of a conflict by changing one person alone, because the conflict depends on their interactions. So by changing one person alone, if we have a very bad opposite conflict with a strong winner and loser, one person alone, by just changing their attitude without changing the other person, can at least get both of them to be neutral. So this says, you know, one person, if they understand enough about the dynamics, without changing the strategy of the other person, can change the way the conflict is going.
One person in this case is one of the two actors in the equation. So
Right.
it's not necessarily one person in Gaza in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
It's one person, Larry and Andrea, opposite to opposite, creating this kind of realization. Then clearly
Right,
the change of one has a huge effect on the system itself.
Right, that's an important clarification. So if it was a group, there would be a change in all the
The group.
Israelis and all the Palestinians
Yeah.
together. So, okay, good. So, all right, so now we come to this. So this is a container of Tropicana oranges. So when I show this in Europe, nobody knows what this is. But here, everybody knows what this is. So,
East Coast is definitely Tropicana coast.
right. So where I live, I get this from a store called Publix. You would get this from Giant, okay, around the corner
You
here.
don't get this from the groves, you don't go and reach right into the
No.
television says you can.
It's actually hard to get really good fresh oranges in Florida. There are some places that serve fresh oranges that it's squeezed, but it's actually harder than you think. I get that from Whole Foods, which I should say Fresh Fields for here, but it, it's all right. But I get this a lot. So I'm really into this for about a week, and I drink the oranges. I really like the oranges, and then I'm not into the oranges anymore. And so it sits in the refrigerator for about 3 or 4 months, and I eventually notice it's got a date on it. It's like expired a long time ago. So now I got to get rid of this. And so what I do is I take it to the sink and I start to spill it out in the sink. Okay, and you notice this is the one with some pulp. So this comes without pulp or much pulp. So as soon as I start to spill it out in the sink, the pulp accumulates in the drain. Okay, and it's not going down. The liquid isn't going down. So now I have one of two things that I can do. The first thing, and we technically call this in equations, the steady state. In other words, I could keep spilling the orange juice as slowly as possible so the liquid filters through the pulp. But that's very inefficient. I don't do that. I don't think you would do that either. You take the pulp and you take it out of the drain and you put it in another part of the sink and you spill it fast, and then the pulp accumulates and you take it out, you put it, okay. So the importance of this, in a lot of equations, we're always looking for the steady state. But a lot of things in real life have to do with alternating mechanisms of things. And in this case, between alternating spilling and taking out the pulp, I can do things a lot more efficiently. So this and some other things got us to ask, what happens if people switch strategies? What would that do? And the point is that if we have this...
Which is also the consequences of your observation before, that if you are in an opposite mode, and you have those changes in one of the two, you have such a dramatic effect.
Right. So it actually came out from thinking of at least 2 groups of people that I know, which work very closely together, but every once in a while the leader of the group does something really nasty to someone in the group, who are all friends. And I didn't understand, why would someone do that? Why would someone suddenly change their attitude? So in this opposite conflict, one group alone, by switching their strategy, can break the system out of equilibrium into the oscillations, the ups and downs of the same opposite case. But now, if that one group switches back to their original strategy, it's equivalent to running the original calculation with new starting conditions. But I told you the outcome is sensitive to these starting conditions. So this means that one group alone, by careful timing of what it does, can change the outcome of a conflict for both groups. So let me now show you a simulation where that happens. So here, this is again the attitude, on the horizontal axis is time. And here we have a conflict where we started the blue group a little bit happier than the red group, and so it winds up to be happier and the red group is unhappy. And again, they're each doing the opposite thing. So the happiness of the blue group reinforces the unhappiness of the red group, and the unhappiness of the red group reinforces the happiness of the blue group. But at this point, the red group changes their attitude to not doing the opposite of the blue, but the same thing. So now we have these oscillations. You can see, since it's trying to do the same thing, it's trying to become happier. And we have these oscillations. And at this point, the red group has now maneuvered itself above the blue group, And at this point, it switches back to doing the opposite. And so now the roles of winner and loser have been reversed. So I'll explain in a moment how we're trying to test this in some experiments, but this shows that maybe intuitively, people have realized that by switching strategies, they have something to gain. So they may have learned these strategies. This shows how the parameters of the model affect how the simulation behaves. So here, when there's only weak interactions, these are the old terminologies, so this should be same and opposite. So you have to read the colors. And so here, what we see is there are oscillations, but when the interaction between the group is weak, the oscillations happen slowly in time. If we make the interactions between the groups stronger, then the oscillations happen faster. And if we make the interactions between the group very strong, then the oscillations happen very fast. And this is what we're trying to look for in the experiments. So first of all, the model predicts that one group alone in this opposite-opposite conflict can change the outcome by temporarily switching to having the same strategy. And so first of all, the model is consistent with some of previous findings from Martin Deutsch, where we have a conflict where everyone tries to cooperate and do the same thing. They both wind up happy, or they could both wind up being unhappy. In a conflict where they do the opposite things, which he calls competition, one person will wind up happy and the other unhappy. Deutsch also says this is not the only outcome in a conflict like this. It's also possible that if people try to do the opposite of each other, both of them wind up being unhappy. So this conflict has multiple outcomes, all of which are not predicted by this model. It also suggests that there's this threshold which is quantitatively equal to the people's inertia to change, above which everything is different. In this particular reference, actually built both a model and had data from a construction crew. And they monitored the interactions and the conflicts in the construction crew. And when the conflicts in the construction crew exceeded a threshold, then the behavior changed dramatically. And so these are the predictions from the model. And again, what we're trying to do is not to evaluate all the parameters, but see if we can get some interesting behavior that we can test. So we predict that a subject should switch between the same and opposite responses, but these should be related to how strong the subject feels about a topic. And the stronger they feel about a topic, the shorter should be the duration of their switches. So what we're doing is first using a questionnaire of about 60 questions to determine the strength of a subject to different topics. And then we have a situation where we have the subject and a confederate. So these are the usual Psychology 1 undergraduate volunteers and that we use with everything. And so each person asks a question and the other person answers. And we can always have the confederate give a negative answer to whatever the subject says, or a positive answer. So we control what feedback the subject is getting. And if we give constant negative feedback, usually if someone says nasty things to you all the time, you'll start to respond in a not happy way. But we predict that the subject should switch temporarily to giving a positive response, a same response. But we predict that the duration of those should be shorter on the questionnaire items that are hotter topics than the cooler topics. And we're just starting to analyze some data from this. We already know that when the subject is positive versus negative response, a confederate gives negative rather than positive response, the subject does behave differently. So we already have statistical verification of that, and we're working towards setting up really this experiment. We're also working with simulations with more than 2 people. This is a simulation with 6 people. And what's interesting here, all the interactions between the people are the same. So they're completely symmetric reactions. In this case, everyone reacts negatively to everyone else. But you can see that the group of 6 break up into 2 groups, one of which is actually happy and the other unhappy. But there are 2 groups, so even though there are no differences between how anyone behaves with anyone else, we see a spontaneous formation of a pattern where we have 2 groups being formed. So that's sort of intriguing. We also see sometimes in some of the simulations, this is a simulation with 4 people, that we have oscillations and time-dependent phenomena in the system. And this is also a particularly interesting one. Again, these are plots of attitude vertically and time horizontally. This is a simulation with 4 people, and you can see they go through oscillations, but at a certain point it goes clink, and we have one group that's happy, or actually in this case neutral, and another group that's unhappy. And actually, although the circumstances to set this up are a little bit special, they're not completely special. Sometimes in dynamical systems, you can be in what's called a transient for a very long time, and it suddenly goes click, and you reach these states which are called fixed points or stable states of the system. And again, it's important to realize there is no external influence on this system. These 4 people had all these ups and downs together, and then suddenly they went click, and they all wound up having the same attitudes. In this case, all the interactions between the people are unsymmetric, but these somewhat subtle differences between how people interact lead to this sort of interesting dynamical behavior. So this system, which seems pretty simple, is actually very rich in different dynamical behavior. Maybe for a moment, I'll just make another point. One of the interesting things is very often the same equations can apply to many different things. So here this is an electric spark going from the center to the outside. This is actually the deposition of a chemical, actually zinc sulfate on an electrode. And this is actually injecting water into oil. And they form patterns which are not exactly the same, but which are pretty similar because they can all be described by the same underlying mathematical equations. So the equations look the same, it's just that the variable in the equation represents something different. And it turns out the equations we're using for conflict also represent something else, which we're studying. So they actually represent genes in cells. So these genes, which determine the genetics and the structure of the cell, the DNA, and the way it works is DNA is made into messenger RNA, which is made into proteins. And then some of these proteins come back and attach on the DNA and shut down genes, or maybe they turn on genes. These proteins are called transcription factors. And they're very important. So this is a system of genes where each gene turns off the other gene. So this is the same opposite feedback model that we've been studying. Only this one is really important because blood cells, stem cells that live in the bone marrow, will differentiate, and about 5 million of these do this a day in you, and they start to differentiate and become along the line of things that will be red blood cells or white blood cells, and depending which one they become is whether one of these 2 genes is the winner or the loser. So in this case, this particular gene, GATA1, has been elevated, and in this case, the other gene, PU1, has been elevated. And this is exactly like the model with the 2 people interacting, where one is happy and the other is unhappy. Here, the happy or unhappy corresponds to the expression of these genes. And what's really interesting is that some people, in trying to understand this model, have also said they think that some of these genes make a protein which attaches to the same gene and stimulates the same gene. So this is really interesting if you think about it. It's not clear whether this is the case or not, actually. But what this does is that once the system starts to make more of this, it's going to self-reinforce it. It's really interesting to think about how this applies to conflicts. So the advantage of studying more than one thing is that you can see analogies that apply back and forth. So actually our studies of conflict are helpful in us in studying this genetic system and vice versa. In terms of these loops are a little bit like what Andrea Novak calls his what was the pool, what was the word? Reservoir. And in that once a conflict starts, people build up bad enough feelings that they become self-reinforcing. And so maybe these loops are equally important in conflicts. And in the gene case, people can actually change the DNA so that the protein that this thing makes doesn't attach to it anymore. And people have been able to do that actually in animal models. And when they do that, this whole system gets messed up. And instead of making a nice balance between red blood cells and white blood cells, they make far too many white blood cells, which is called leukemia. It's a cancer of the blood system. So when these self-reinforcing loops don't work in the right way, things get very badly messed up. So it's interesting that some of these experiments you can do easier with people, and some you can do easily by putting chemicals on the genes. And so we're sort of working both ends of this. So, the gene stuff is being done in collaboration with a student and a professor in mathematics at our place, and with some collaborators in Munich, Germany, who do either computational modeling, who actually do real experiments on stem cells. So we're trying to make some predictions that they can test. So the summary of this is in the genes, it should be able to understand how the dynamics of how the genes interact, to understand how they differentiate into different types of cells. And if we can understand that, maybe we can drive the differentiation backward, or even change a cell from one cell type to another. And we're trying to do these predictions and then run the experiments. And in terms of people, it means we can construct a rigorous mathematical model of how the state of each group depends on its state and the influence of the other group. And this allows us to compute the consequences of different types of interaction between the group. And some of these interactions are much more complicated than we would have thought from our very simple assumptions about this system. And some of the results match our intuition, and others are interesting and give us new ideas and thoughts for new experiments. And this was meant to sort of be a speculation, so it says speculation in bold. In that in physics, over the last 250 years, we gave up using words because we thought the equations were better. Even though the equations are shadows of the real things, they're so much better at understanding the consequences of our predictions that we stuck to using them. And right now, biology is going much more in this direction with a number of different techniques, because there are 40,000 genes and they make more than that number of proteins, and everything interacts with everything else. And we need the mathematics to keep it straight. Words are no good anymore. And maybe in the next 350 years, maybe, we don't know, maybe those sort of equations would be useful in terms of understanding how people interact. And the closing line here, which I actually don't have the quote, so I can, maybe you will have the quote.
Say it by
yeah, to paraphrase it, Gandhi basically, well, let me preface it by saying the problem is that this sort of mathematics is alien to a lot of people in the social sciences. And not only the mathematics, but how to think about it. And Gandhi says basically things are going along okay. And then all of a sudden, the universe conspires to present you a crisis. And the only way you can solve the crisis is to do the single thing that's the last thing that you wanted to do, that you hate to do, that you think you're not capable of doing, that is you don't want to do it all, but that's what you need to solve the crisis. And so what you do is you try as hard as possible. You get your friends, you learn about things, and you try and you fail and you try again, and you do that thing that's the last thing you want to do to solve the crisis. And you know what the universe does next? The universe conspires to present you a crisis where the only way you can solve the crisis is to do the second most thing that you never wanted to do, that you're not good at doing, that you don't want to do. And what Gandhi says about this is that this isn't a bad thing, that overcoming the struggle to overcome these challenges is actually a good thing for you. And as I said, we don't know whether these mathematical things will eventually become useful enough to capture the richness of people or not. In physics, they sort of were, although there are a lot of unresolved issues in physics too. But this is maybe a different perspective at looking at some conflict issues.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Very nice, very different, I'm sure, than many of the classes and approach that you had so far. I have a few comments, but I wanted to take advantage of Louis' presence to have sort of an impromptu, non-requested, sort of first respondent occasion.
Okay. I'm one of those people that doesn't get mathematics at all, doesn't think that way. What I saw when you were talking about same, opposite, opposite, same, opposite, was I just kept thinking about the oil pricing exercise. Are you familiar
No,
with that?
no.
Are you familiar with that? Yeah, most people are familiar with that. Where groups get to choose without seeing what the other group is doing, how they're going to value something, and when one group, they start out each trying to get the best for themselves,
Uh-huh.
opposite, opposite. And when one group changes to try to